We heard a little bit of the history of Juneteenth and our time for all ages. I want to go into a little more detail and share a bit of what I learned this week as I was looking into it. On September 22nd, 1862, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, but it didn't take effect until January 1st, 1863. That very important New Year's Eve, some tremendous watch parties took place. Enslaved African Americans gathered in churches and in private homes across the country, waiting for the official start of the Emancipation Proclamation to take effect. At the stroke of midnight, all enslaved people in the Confederate States were declared legally free. Union soldiers, some of whom were black, marched onto plantations across cities, spreading the news in Confederate states. I never really thought of the timeline from this perspective and the waiting and anticipation before. Focusing on Lincoln's leadership, we often celebrate the Emancipation Proclamation as the moment of freedom, forgetting that it did little for enslaved people in the Confederate States. In the westernmost Confederate state of Texas, enslaved people wouldn't be free for another 2.5 years. On June 19, 1865, about 2 months after Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox, Gordon Granger, a Union general, arrived in Galveston, Texas. He came to inform enslaved African Americans of their freedom and that the war was over. General Granger's announcement put into effect the Emancipation Proclamation that had been issued nearly 2.5 years earlier. At that moment, 250,000 enslaved black people in Texas were free by executive order. That day became known as Juneteenth by the newly freed people in Texas. For several years, folks in the Galveston area celebrated in their homes and their churches. Later in 1872, a group of African American ministers and business people in Houston purchased a 10-acre piece of land and called it Emancipation Park. And it thrives today as a place for gathering and learning. In 1980, Texas became the first state to designate Juneteenth as a holiday. I was a little surprised with that one. And celebrations expanded from backyards into big parades and city gatherings in Atlanta and Washington. Over the past few years, there's been a lot more increase in celebration of Juneteenth across the country. In the wake of nationwide protests against police brutality, the push for federal recognition of Juneteenth gained serious momentum, and Congress passed legislation in the summer of 2021. On June 17, 2021, President Biden signed the bill making Juneteenth the 11th holiday recognized by the federal government. The law went into effect immediately. It's officially known as Juneteenth National Independence Day, and I am thrilled to celebrate this year. I do sometimes wonder how it feels for the black community to have bunches of white people celebrating Juneteenth. How does it feel to have your community's history of slavery and liberation culminate in a day off of work for everyone, including some pretty racist white folks? My point of reference is the trepidation I sometimes feel as straight allies and corporations wrap themselves in rainbows in June. The rainbow flag is a symbol of LGBT liberation, a marker of safe spaces for queer people. In the 90s, it was a bold, even kind of dangerous decision to have a rainbow sticker on my car. Very few straight people, no matter how supportive, would have been flying a rainbow flag back then, when most of us needed safety. The profusion of rainbows this June is a nice affirmation, but it can feel a little bit confusing. This sermon isn't about pride flags, it's about Juneteenth. What I want us to dig into is how we celebrate liberation with a marginalized community while many of us are part of the dominant culture. How do we celebrate together with integrity? Now, one thing seems abundantly clear. Celebrating as allies, we acknowledge that there is still much work to be done, many more battles to be fought, even as we celebrate. This journey that we're on together is a long one. The history of Juneteenth itself reminds us that waves of progress and regression have taken place for the Black community. As I was looking into it, Juneteenth could be called the kickoff of the Reconstruction era. As a little reminder, the 12 years of Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877, marked an era of hope, as formerly enslaved people reunified their families, established schools, ran for political office, and even, in some cases, sued slaveholders for compensation. Considering the 200-plus years of enslavement immediately preceding Reconstruction, the changes the Black community achieved were nothing short of astonishing in that period. Not even a generation out of slavery, African Americans transformed this country. During Reconstruction, Congress officially abolished slavery, passing the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, essentially guaranteeing newly freed people the same rights as white people. And the then progressive Republican Party took control of all Southern state governorships and legislatures, except for Virginia. The Republican coalition elected many Black leaders to local, state, and national offices. More than 100 Black ministers were elected to state legislatures during Reconstruction, as well as several to Congress and one to U.S. Senate. It's a long time ago. We spend a lot of time learning about segregation and the Klan and Jim Crow. We often forget that that period of vicious repression was a backlash from a period of tremendous progress. The pendulum of progress and reaction keeps on swinging to this day. While structural inequity persists for the Black community, the issue that's gained most attention recently has been police violence. Following the killing of George Floyd, who died in the custody of Minneapolis police in 2020, thousands of people around the United States poured into the streets in protest. George Floyd's name, as well as the name of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and others, became a rallying cry for change across the country, and progress inched forward. In Minneapolis, officials banned the use of chokeholds by police. Democrats in Congress introduced legislation targeting misconduct and racial discrimination by the police. In April of 2021, Derek Chauvin, the former police officer, was found guilty of 2 counts of murder in the death of Mr. Floyd. And 2 months later, June 17, 2021, President Biden signed legislation making Juneteenth a national holiday. As we celebrate Juneteenth, we recognize that the struggle continues. Major structural inequalities persist, and tremendous political power is being exerted to disenfranchise Black voters, especially in the South, even today. Knowing there remains work to be done, we choose to celebrate with the Black community. We choose to acknowledge success as a fuel for hope for a still better future. Still, there's something a little complicated about celebrating another community's progress. Earlier this year, I had the opportunity to travel in Atlanta. It's a cultural hub for so much Black culture. While I was there, I was able to visit the area where Dr. King was raised as a child and where he served as a pastor and where he's now buried. We visited the museum at the Welcome Center there. After the museum, we were waiting for an Uber to pick us up, and I tried to engage some of my friends in conversation about what we had just experienced at this museum. The conversation was cut short when one of my friends said, "I get it, white people are bad." I was baffled. It was not what the museum was about at all. I saw exhibit after exhibit about prophetic leadership, about Black and white people working together to create change. Yes, it told a story of oppression, but more than that, the museum celebrated the history and the ongoing work of resistance and liberation. It was eye-opening to me that in the midst of that deeply inspiring museum, the primary takeaway for anyone was white people are bad. Looking back, of course, there are several questions I should have asked to dig deeper. Still, it was helpful to me to learn how complicated it can be for members of the dominant group to recognize and celebrate hard-won victories of marginalized people. There's still work to be done for white people to acknowledge the privilege that we hold. Thank you, Linda, for opening our eyes a little bit to that history this morning. The call is also to come to the table to celebrate and create beloved community together. There's space for celebration as we struggle to create justice together. Sometimes two different dates get crammed into a Sunday, and it isn't clear how to honor both of them. I want to suggest that with Father's Day and Juneteenth, we have the capacity to hold some difficult feelings and to celebrate at the same time. On Monday, probably a little late, I went shopping for a Father's Day card at Target. You basically have two choices. You may have experienced this. There are cards that are totally humorous and surface level, and there are cards that lay on a thick layer of sentimentality, describing Dad's perfection in excruciating detail. As an adult, picking one or the other is really dissatisfying. Now, I love my dad and respect him. I wrote a whole sermon about that several years ago, and that obscenely large desk in my office is there because it was his desk through his professional career. I appreciate him deeply. And he is not the perfect father depicted in those greeting cards. There were some missed opportunities. But for me, it's still a day to celebrate. I'm not a parent myself. I experience Father's Day from a child's perspective only. I imagine this holiday might bring some complex feelings for dads, too. No one lives up to a perfect archetype. There have to be some disappointments at shortcomings. And I'm sure, at least I hope, there's also a healthy dose of well-earned pride in what you have done to shape the life of another human being. Whether a father or a child of a father, that's complicated stuff. And we find space in our hearts to honor difficult realities and to celebrate at the same time. Unitarian Universalism is fundamentally an optimistic faith. We believe in the inherent worth and dignity not just of some people, but of every person, or at least we try to. We believe in a generous universe where life and love thrive in inspiring ways. None of that is perfect or complete, but still we choose. We do our best to align ourselves with hope. In just a minute, we'll sing our closing hymn, Lift Every Voice and Sing. It's often called the Black National Anthem. Now, if you listen closely, this hymn contains some of the harshest lyrics in our entire hymnal. I invite you to sit with those words and to honor them. And this song of pride and liberation is, in the end, a celebration. There are layers of our histories, crushing disappointments, and so much to celebrate. And we have the capacity to live in that ambiguity. As we continue to build the world we dream about, let us celebrate the progress that we have made thus far. Amen.